Did you ever wonder what some famous people sounded like when they talked? You know, you can study people in the history books, you can see photos of them, you can even see film of them, and start to form an idea in your mind of what they were like, what they sounded like, what they looked like in person, how tall were they? You know, what was it like to actually be around them? What was their personality really like? There's only so much we can learn from history books. I thought it would be kind of interesting and a little bit fun if we took some time every so often to take a look at some of the actual footage that we have of famous people just in normal conversation or in settings where we have an opportunity to really get a sense of who they are. Today we're going to take a look at some of the generals on the German side from World War II, some of the highest ranking, most influential members of the German military. So I'm going to just introduce each one of these, give you a little bit of background if you're not familiar with who each of these people are. And then we're just going to listen to them talk and just make some observations about that. I hope you enjoy this. If you want to see more of it, please don't forget to hit that like button. Subscribe if you're new. I would love to get the chance to know you a little bit better. Let me know in the comment section below and introduce yourself. Let's dive in to some of the most famous generals of World War II and how they sounded when they talked. First one, and I think probably the one that most people are going to be interested in, is Erwin Rommel. Erwin Rommel was a hero of World War I. He led a platoon and then later moved up to company command in World War I. Or very early on led a platoon outside of Verdun. That was his first combat in 1914. He later becomes the company commander, sent to the Italian front. I think he fought in Romania for a while, but highly decorated and very good soldier from the earliest days of his career. When World War II breaks out, he's, I think, a major general, and his initial command was actually commanding the defense of the Fuhrer's headquarters during the invasion of Poland. He eventually, in 1940, gets command of armored units, and that's where he really makes a name for himself as the Desert Fox in Africa. And then, of course, he is given the defense of France during the invasion of Normandy. And not long after that is implicated in the assassination attempt of July 1944 and is forced to take his own life. But this is what he sounded like when he talked.
In der Zahl weit unterlegen waren, griffen wir bei Michili am 6. April 1941 an. Ja, wir stießen sogar mit Teilen unserer Streitmacht gleichzeitig nach Dernau, dort schon die Küstenstraße im Besitz zu bekommen.
Now, I will say this about him. He sounds exactly like I expected him to. I don't know, sometimes you hear a voice and you're surprised. But for him, he just sounds exactly like I expected him to.
Dem Feind den weiteren Rückzug aus der Cyrenaica zu verlegen. Auch dieser Einbruch in Tobruk, der bereits bis zum Wege hatte, leider Gottes nicht zum Erfolg gewarten, nämlich die Festung ganz zu nehmen.
So some of these, they're from like propaganda films, things like that. Other ones that we're going to see come from trials, different things like that. So there are a variety of settings. But that's Erwin Rommel, kind of exactly what I expected from him, I think. But some of these I expect will probably be a little different. This next one is Heinrich Guderian, another one of the most well-known generals from the Second World War on the German side. One of the pioneers, not only of Blitzkrieg, but also of the Panzer divisions. And he leads troops in the invasion of the Soviet Union, the failed invasion of the Soviet Union. Actually gets sacked after that, but then eventually is recalled to service and ends up actually the acting general-in-chief in the aftermath of the July assassination attempt on Hitler. And it's in the aftermath of that he's actually placed in command of the courts, the kangaroo courts, really, that just issued summary executions of a number of people in the aftermath of that plot. He died, I think, about 10 years after the war. He spent a couple of years imprisoned after the war, but really didn't suffer too many consequences, did a lot of writing afterwards, and was one of the people who were proponents of what we call the clean Wehrmacht myth, which is the idea that what was happening, the atrocities that happened by the German government The army had nothing to do with that. The army was just fighting a war. They were just fighting for their country. They didn't have anything to do with that other stuff, but that was baloney.
40 standen wir vor der Aufgabe, den Durchbruch durch die verlängerte Maginot-Linie bei Sedan zu vollziehen. Wir waren uns darüber klar, dass dieses schwierige Unternehmen nur gelingen und der Erfolg nur ausgenutzt werden konnte.
I don't know what I expected his voice to sound like, but I feel like that isn't it. But I mean, it looks like it fits with what he's talking. I've never heard him talk before, but it's very interesting. We don't have a translation for this one, and my German's not real great yet, so I'm not entirely sure what he's talking about.
Wenn Führer und Truppen
talking about
sorgfältig
Führer.
darauf vorbereitet wurden. Unsere Winter- und Frühjahrsarbeit bestand daher in eifriger theoretischer und
He's talking about
praktischer
Operation
Ausbildung der
Barbarossa.
Divisionen, in eingehenden Überlegungen für das neuartige Zusammenwirken mit unserer Luftwaffe und in der
Luftwaffe.
Vorbereitung der Führer auf die bei erfolgreichem Durchbruch.
So again, that's kind of like a propaganda film that was made, and he's talking about the invasion of the Soviet Union. So interesting. Not sure what I expected with him. Erich von Manstein was actually the one who came up with the strategy, the very successful strategy for invading France in 1940. I don't know a whole lot about his history before the war. I know after the war, he actually was a NATO advisor as a part of West Germany. Had actually been convicted of some war crimes, but only spent like 4 years in prison for the war crimes he was convicted of. So it'll be interesting to hear what he sounds like. He was a little older than some of the other generals during World War II.
Eine Elite, als sie aufgrund ihrer
Not what I
taktischen
expected.
Befähigung ausgewählt wurden und aufgrund ihres Charakters.
His voice is way higher than I expected. And honestly, you know what that reminds me a lot of is General Patton on the American side, whose voice wasn't real high, but it's very different than what you think it would be, especially after seeing the movie Patton, because George C. Scott, who I think played Patton brilliantly and really captured his spirit, didn't sound anything like George Patton.
Tonangebend im
Very
Heere
different than I thought.
waren sie insofern nicht, als sie in ihren Auffassungen ja genau mit allen anderen Offizieren übereinstimmten.
Interesting. So he was born in like 1887. So he would have been, he's right around the age of George Patton, going on 60 when the war's over. Interesting. Wilhelm Keitel was one of the German field marshals who was put on trial for some pretty major war crimes at Nuremberg, and that's where you're going to hear him talk here. He was executed for those crimes. I believe he was found guilty on all counts. Executed for his war crimes. He was one of Hitler's top generals and was very involved before the war and during the war with a lot of the behind-the-scenes stuff that was happening. And again, was very involved in the trials after the July plot. Was one of the people most responsible for the execution of thousands of people in the aftermath of that. So let's hear what he sounded like.
Dieser Dienststellung durch die Beweisführung und durch das Plädoyer meines Verteidigers dargelegt.
Pretty much what I expected he
Ich
sounded
habe
like.
geirrt und war nicht imstande zu verhindern, was hätte verhindert werden müssen.
You can get a little sense of the defiance in the man and a little sense of his personality right there. Several of these guys were very defiant at the trials, but he's pretty forceful with it.
Das ist meine Schuld.
That is my something.
Es ist tragisch, einsehen zu müssen, dass das Beste, was ich als Soldat zu geben hatte,
Something about soldiers.
Gehorsam und Treue.
Pretty interesting. He seems like he could be a fiery guy when he needed to be. I can see why he was probably well liked at the top. Erich Raeder was the head of the German Navy for the first part of the war. He had actually been head of the German Navy for a while before the war even started. Was another guy that was convicted post-war of war crimes, and was sentenced to life. He actually was surprised. He thought he would be sentenced to death. He had been captured by the Soviets at the end of the war and was convinced he would die, but he didn't. He was sentenced to life and thinking like the mid-1950s was released because of bad health and died just a few years after being released. Let's see what he sounded like.
Die eine war die, dass Hitler selbst mich nicht mehr gutierte und ich das merkte, dass ich also infolgedessen keinen Ungehorsam beging,
About what I
wenn ich
expected
ihm
with him.
gewissermaßen mein Amt auf den Tisch warf, aus irgendeinem Grunde. Und zweitens, weil...
I don't know what the context is of that one, but you can hear some kind of talking going on in the background, so I thought that one was pretty interesting. Let's see who's next. Garen von Roonstedt is another one of those field marshals of the German army who held a number of significant commands. He's the guy who calls the halt to the German offensive outside of Dunkirk, which allows the British to be able to get their troops back home and save hundreds of thousands from being captured or killed. He was fired a couple of times during the war. Once after, I'm trying to remember, it happened once, and I think he was fired one time after Normandy, after the invasion of Normandy, after they failed to stop that. And then I think he was fired again right near the end of the war. They were going to put him on trial for war crimes as well, but he was already in pretty bad health, and so he was basically allowed to skate on everything.
Die Politik haben wir Generale uns nicht gekümmert. Wir haben an keinen politischen Beratungen teilgenommen und haben auch...
This sounds like it could almost be the same place that the last recording was. You can kind of hear that background talking and things like that going on, but probably one of the ones who sounds most like I expected him to.
Uns keine politischen Beratungen abgehalten. Ich möchte hierbei mir ein Wort des berühmten englischen Feldmarschalls Montgomery zu eigen machen.
So he said something there about Field Marshal Montgomery, which is pretty interesting, who, of course, he took on in Western France. Interesting. All right, let's see who's next. Joachim Piper was not a high-ranking officer compared to a lot of these guys like field marshals and grand admirals. He's well known, though, because he was a Waffen-SS commander who kind of embodied that idea of that fanatical member of that unit. And he is the one who was convicted and sentenced to death for the Malmedy massacre, which took place during the Battle of the Bulge. His sentence was actually eventually upheld, but then later overturned and sent to life in prison, and then later he was actually released before he was murdered in France in the 1970s. Let's see what he sounded like.
Wie heißen Sie?
Joachim Piper.
Hardegg machte mir eine Äußerung gegenüber.
Hardegg made an expression towards me,
in welcher ausführte,
wherein he explained to me
dass sie kein Pardon geben würden,
that they would not give any pardon.
He seems like a really cold fish, if you know what I mean. I mean, wow, he I can see why he was a member of that unit.
Da sie ebenfalls erschossen werden würden, wenn sie in Feindes Hand fielen.
Because they would be shot in the same manner if they would happen to fall into enemy's hand.
Und dass sie eingesetzt würden unter den gleichen Verhältnissen wie die britischen Kommando.
He just seems very matter of fact, very just kind of, well, this is the way it is, you know what I mean? Wow. I just get a really weird vibe from that dude. I think most of us are familiar with Herman Garing, who is in charge of the Luftwaffe. He was actually in the same unit with the Red Baron during World War I and eventually took command of that unit. I think there was one person in between after Manfred von Richthofen was shot down. There was somebody else that took over, and then it was Herman Garing who took command of that unit. Well-known, highly decorated war hero of the First World War. He is captured in the aftermath of World War II. He's one of the right-hand men of the leadership there, and is sentenced to death, loses a bunch of weight while he's in prison, and somehow cons one of his guards, one of his American guards, into, we don't know exactly how it happened, but he ended up getting a pill where he was able to take his own life right before they were going to execute him.
Mir nicht ausdrücklich verboten. Ich weiß nicht, ob der Führer
Pretty charismatic
wusste,
guy.
dass ich es in der Tasche hatte. Hat aber generell es verboten dadurch,
So it's interesting to contrast him with the guy we saw a minute ago who was very cold, very calculated. Garing's a lot more animated, a lot more kind of, you can just tell he's comfortable up there. He's more of a politician type and kind of knows how to play the crowd a little bit.
Hätte ausliefern müssen, nämlich Herrn von Ribbentrop, die
Auslieferung
verboten hat, sodass ich dieses Memorandum tatsächlich gegen das
And he kind of took the lead among the defendants at Nuremberg and kind of organized everything and was kind of looked to as one of the people who was kind of out there setting the tone for everyone else. So interesting I've heard him talk before. That's not the first time I've heard him, but it's interesting to contrast him with some of the others. Alfred Yodel was actually the general who signed the surrender of the German army. He was immediately arrested along with a lot of others, put on trial at Nuremberg, and was defiantly just committed to the idea that he had done nothing wrong except be a good soldier during the war. And I think his last words were something along the lines of like, dedicating himself to the eternal Germany, and he pled not guilty before God and before the people and everything like that. But he was executed along with a number of others in Nuremberg.
Die oft ihren Führungsgrundsätzen und ihren überkommenen, erprobten Anschauungen widersprachen. Mit Truppen und Polizeikräften, die nicht ihrer vollen Befehlsgewalt unterstanden.
It's interesting to watch him speak. I feel like he truly believes he was just being a soldier and that he wasn't really like doing anything evil with evil intent. Whether he did or not, I don't know enough about Yodel's story to know. I have a feeling that he couldn't have been at that high level of command for as long as he was without having some idea of what was going on and even being done by the army. But he does seem kind of resigned to his fate a little bit as he speaks. Not defiant at all.
Und mit einem Nachrichtendienst, der teilweise für den Gegner arbeitete.
Interesting. I get a very different vibe from him than I do from a lot of these other guys. I almost am tempted to feel sympathetic for him, but I don't because I know what went on. Interesting. Karl Dennitz, I believe, was made president of Germany after the other guy took himself out. I don't want to say his name too much. I don't want to get demonetized. But he lives till 1980. He's one of the last surviving members of the high command of Germany from World War II when he dies in 1980. He was put on trial, but obviously not executed for any crimes that he committed. Let's see what he sounded like. He was an admiral. And you notice, interesting choice on his part that he's not wearing his Grand Admiral's uniform. He's dressed as a civilian. That idea that, he was the president of Germany. And I think he's trying to put forth that notion that I'm not a military guy. I'm civilian leadership. I was put in that position at the end of the war.
Zwischen Herrn Eckart und dem Abteilungschef ist mir nicht vorgelegt worden, was eindeutig hervorgeht aus den Abzeichnungen.
Again, he comes across a little bit as both. You can tell there's the military in him, but he's also, I think he's trying to be cool and calm and collected, but also make his defense as forcefully as he could, and it obviously worked because he wasn't executed with many of the others. The last one we're going to look at is Friedrich Paulus. This is the guy who's best known as the man who surrendered the army that was attacking Stalingrad. He was the one who finally gave up, even though he'd been ordered not to, was imprisoned by the Soviets, and actually becomes a very vocal critic of his old regime that he served. And I don't believe he ever was convicted of any war crimes. If he did, he didn't really do a lot of time. Probably in part because it was good propaganda to have him speaking out. And I think he was eventually sent back to East Germany. Let's hear what he sounded like. Another guy dressed in civilian clothes.
Dienst beim Oberkommando des Heeres an, als Oberquartiermeister I des Generalstabes.
Another very military man.
Als solcher hatte ich den Chef des Generalstabes zu vertreten.
Probably the deepest voice of all the ones we've heard so far.
Und im Übrigen die Aufträge im Allgemeinen operativer Art, die mir zuwies, zu erledigen.
Pretty interesting stuff. Let me know what you think. What surprised you about what you heard? What didn't surprise you? What feelings did you get from listening to these guys talk? Do you want to see more things like this? And if so, do you have a suggestion of something you'd like to see in particular? Let me know in the comment section below. Please hit that like button if you would. And we'll see you tomorrow with some more content. Thanks for watching.